Thank you for joining us today. My name is Will Simons. It's a pleasure to be with you. Nice to be doing this with Campbell Property Management yet again. I want to say it's been 3-4 years now that we've been doing these, and we always get a lot of great feedback, a lot of great turnout. So Ashley and your team, thank you very much for the opportunity. I appreciate it. For those of you out there, I'm going to say hello on camera here in the beginning just for a moment. I'll turn off my camera during the majority of the class just so everyone can focus on the slides. And then I'll come back on again at the end for that Q&A portion. Today's class is called Fundamentals of Reserves. Should go for maybe a little under an hour, 45-50 minutes or so. And then we'll have time for Q&A. Usually we have a lot of great questions come in. We may not have time to get through all of them, but I will try to get through as many as I can. So as Ashley said, please feel free during the session here to use that Q&A button on the Zoom taskbar, and then we'll get through all those at the end, okay? One other quick housekeeping note, this has only happened once and hopefully just the one time, but in the event of technical difficulties, if I happen to lose internet or power during the presentation, please stay in the class, stay in the recording. I will try to get back on as soon as possible. Ashley can tell some knock-knock jokes while I'm doing that. So we'll do our best. One more reminder for all the CAMs attending today. As Ashley said, we will be reporting all the course credits to the DBPR. So about a week from now, feel free to log in and check, make sure that you've got the credit. If not, you can reach out to one of us and we can help you out with that. So with that said, thank you for joining. Turn off my camera and introduce myself and our company in a little bit more detail. So. Okay, yes, so my name is Will Simons. I'm the president of the Florida office for our company, Association Reserves. I've been with the company since 2008. I've spent most of my career in Florida. We've had clients in Florida going back to the early 1990s. The RS after my name stands for Reserve Specialist. So a Reserve Specialist is a credential that's awarded by CAI, and that's given to providers in our industry who have demonstrated their experience and expertise specifically in preparing reserve studies. If you're not familiar with CAI, it's the Community Associations Institute, kind of a governing body that oversees a lot of us types of providers and communities that are scattered all throughout the country and even around the world. Personally, I've lived in both condos and HOAs. I spent about 6 years serving as the treasurer and then vice president of my own HOA in South Florida. We had a budget there of a little over $1 million, about 635 homes. And the reason that I always like to point that out is because I do know what it's like to be on the other side of the table, right? I know this is a thankless job for a lot of you out there, and I salute you. You know, you guys are out there every day doing what you can to try and make life better for your communities. So hopefully this material today will help you to do that as well. For a little bit background on our company, we are the oldest and largest reserve study provider in the United States. We've been doing this since 1986, and we've completed tens of thousands of reserve studies for all different types of properties all around the world. We have offices from coast to coast and more credentialed reserve specialists on staff than any other company. The majority of the work that we do, of course, is for community associations, which, as you know, includes all different types of condos, HOAs, timeshares, and other residential properties. But we also have a great deal of experience with other property types. So office buildings, hotels, resort properties, country clubs, worship facilities, marinas, and many more. For the last 9 years in a row, we've been very fortunate to be recognized with a Reader's Choice Award winner by the Florida Community Association Journal. And lastly, the one thing I always like to point out is that our only job as a company is preparing reserve studies. Okay, we are not an engineering firm or an accounting firm, but rather a very specialized consulting firm, which is focused on doing one thing really well, which is to guide our clients towards a successful financial future. And the way that we do that is by preparing accurate and reliable reserve studies that hopefully help our clients to forecast and budget for major projects. If we do our job well and our clients follow the plans that we help them to design, hopefully they're able to reduce the risk of special assessments and bank loans and any other type of financial distress. So if you'd like any additional information, background about our company, if you'd like to request a proposal, you can do all of that and more at reservestudy.com. You can see the website down there in the bottom right of the screen. We'll have my email address up on the screen later as well, but if you want to jot that down for now, it is wsimons, so WSIMONS at reservestudy.com. Okay, really just two kind of broad categories for you today. I'll spend a little bit of time in the beginning answering this fairly basic question, what are reserves? And then we'll spend the majority of the class talking about reserve studies and how these documents are used by community associations to make sure they're on the right track with regard to long-term planning. Okay, so please feel free to take notes as you go along. Another reminder, I already see a couple of questions being submitted in the Q&A, which is great. Feel free to let those go as soon as you think of one. Okay, let's get started. Thank you. Two very quick slides, but important slides before we begin. I put this one here in most of the presentations that I do because I think that this illustrates a very common reaction or mindset when it comes to thinking about the future and long-term planning in general. Okay, so what we see out there, what I'm sure a lot of you can relate to in your communities, is this reluctance to embrace the responsibility of thinking about the future, of planning ahead. And I think that this guy here represents this typical attitude that we see when it comes to thinking about budgeting for reserves, right? So if you look at the guy, he's got his eyes closed, fingers crossed, kind of this uncomfortable, stressed out look on his face. If there's one thing I want you to remember from today's class, it's not to be this guy. Don't let this mindset take hold in your community. Okay, it's all of us together, all of our responsibility, whether you're a professional in the field, you're a reserve study provider, a manager, you're an attorney, an accountant, or you're a volunteer or a resident, somebody just an interested homeowner. Use this information, educate the people around you. Let's not let excuses get in the way. Let's help the people that we work with to take action and be responsible for their own futures. Okay, a little bit sadder note with this one, of course. This, as we all know, the last summer, June 24th, I believe, 2021, tragic collapse of Champlain Tower South condominiums, which took the lives of 98 people and resulted in the loss of many, many millions of dollars worth of property value for the people that did survive that. I'm sure everyone's seen the headlines recently, just under $1 billion class action settlement as a result of this tragedy. This is an absolutely horrible moment for all of us in the community association world, but now that we've got a little bit of space from that, I think it would be an even greater tragedy if there were no lasting changes that came as a result of it. It was kind of disappointing this year to see that the legislation didn't end up acting and putting forth any bills, at least for the moment, but our company and others are still very involved in the conversations there, and we do expect that at some point in the future, some things are going to change. But this situation hit especially close to home for us because this property happened to be a client of ours. We had done the one and only reserve study in the history of the building back in the spring of 2020, so about 15 months before the building collapsed. And at that point, we obviously had no idea that something like this could happen, but it was abundantly clear that there were some major financial problems going on at that point. So the only reason I bring this up is to just show that there really are consequences when associations are not taking care of their properties, they're not thinking long-term, they're not maybe setting aside the amount of money that they should. And, I'm not here to say that something tragic might have happened anyways. It remains to be seen if there's some, original defect or design condition that, happened way back in the construction of the building that was just inevitable. But I can tell you that it was a financial disaster long before it was a physical disaster. Okay, so if there's anything I can do today to help any other associations to avoid any preventable financial problems, then that's part of the goal of what we're doing here today. All right, let's dig into the material, and we'll start with this basic question, what are reserves? So for those of you who have been in this field for a while, if you're a manager, if you've been on a board for at least a year or two, hopefully this is fairly elementary stuff. But if you're newer to this profession, if you're not used to drafting a budget, we're going to spend just a couple minutes talking about the two main aspects of any given association's annual budget. So basically, the budget can be categorized into these two main sections. You've got your operating fund, which we'll talk about first, and then the reserve fund. Okay, so your operating funds Those are there for the routine costs of running the business of the community association. Okay, the daily, weekly, monthly expenses for things like utilities, insurance, payroll, preventive maintenance, just the routine day-to-day stuff. That's what the operating money is there for. So if you want to put this kind of in personal finance terms, you can think of your operating account kind of like a personal checking account for an individual. Okay. Operating money is unrestricted, which means that you can spend it on any bill that the association has to pay. And typically that money will be spent in the same year that it's collected. So what that means is that if you've designed a perfect budget, you wouldn't have any operating surplus or deficit at the end of the year, right? You spend all the money that you collect in any given fiscal year within that same calendar year, same fiscal year. Now, on the other hand, you've got reserves. Okay, now your reserve account, that is there for the long-term expenses that the association has to pay for, right? So things that may not happen for 5 or 10 or maybe 25 years at a time, but when they do, these can be some of the biggest bills the association will ever have to pay. So this is, think of things like roof replacements, painting and waterproofing, concrete restoration, pavement resurfacing, and we'll give lots of other examples as we go on. Some of the other important differences here between operating and reserves is that reserve funds are restricted. Okay, that means once you put $1 into a reserve account, it can only be spent on specific things, right? Not just any random project, not any bill that the association has to pay for. Another difference is that, again, in contrast to operating funds, reserve money does accumulate, sometimes over many, many years, with the intention that it's building up an account balance until there's a need, right? Until it needs to be spent for its intended purpose. So if you go back to that kind of personal finance analogy, in that way, think of your reserve account more like a savings account, maybe even something special like a retirement account or a college savings fund, how that would be used by an individual. Okay, on this slide here, I've included a very short excerpt from Florida statutes. And on this one specifically, we're looking at statute 718. Sometimes we call this the Condo Statute. And what I've highlighted in red here, this is the portion of the text that talks about what associations must be reserving for. So if you look at that section, the statute requires that condos reserve for 3 things in particular, and then they add in a general definition at the end. So the 3 things named specifically being roofs, painting, and pavement. And then this general catch-all definition is, and any other item with a replacement cost greater than $10,000. Okay. Now, if you're wondering why did they pick 10 grand, that's a good question. I've been teaching this class for over a decade now. I've asked this question in front of a lot of different audiences, and we've never heard a conclusive answer as to why they picked $10,000 as opposed to, say, $1,000 or $25,000, right? So our guess is that way back when, decades ago, when they wrote the statute, somebody just picked a number that sounded substantial and said, all right, let's go with that. So the point being here is that the $10,000 threshold, that number is totally arbitrary, okay? And the point is, for many associations, that number is probably much too high of a threshold to set, okay? So just keep this in mind for later. We're going to talk about this later as we get into the material, but maybe a more appropriate way to look at any given association with respect to what they should reserve for, you want to think of it this way. What is financially significant to us? If we got caught by surprise for this amount of money, or for many things that cost this amount of money, what does that do to our budget for that year? Okay, on this slide here, we've got the portion of the statutes that talk about what HOAs have to do. So if you're in an HOA, you're subject to statute 720, and that actually has even less to say about what you should be reserving for in your community. So unlike the condo statute, the HOA statute actually does not have any specific checklist of items that you need to include. Instead, pretty much all that it says is that, hey, look, there are certain things that the association is responsible for, and if you don't have reserves, that could result in a special assessment. So not very helpful. But the good news is that there is actually a much more realistic, much more thorough way to go about defining what any size, any type of association should be including in its reserve schedule, which we'll talk about shortly. For now, before we close out this section, I just want to leave you with this fairly basic definition, okay? But there's a few important points to make here. Reserve money is there for a community to save over a long period of time for major repair and replacement projects. Okay, so let's take a pause there. Notice what I did not say. Okay, I didn't say that you can spend reserve money on capital improvements, paying your insurance deductible, or really it shouldn't be used for any other purpose other than major repairs and replacements. So as an example, let's say you've got an association out there that does not have a playground, but all of the residents get together and they say, look, we've got the space for it. Why don't we build a playground? It'll be great for all the kids in the neighborhood. That might be a totally worthwhile and good, smart thing to do, but they couldn't use reserve money for that. Okay, the reason is they're adding a new element to the association, which would have not been considered in any prior year reserve budgets. So what that means is that any prior reserve contributions would have never taken this new cost into account, right? So again, maybe a great idea, but the initial expense, the initial construction development of that playground would have to be funded by some other means, okay? Now going forward, let's say they do it, the playground's there. From that point on, the association should start reserving for it and now thinking of future long-term replacement cycles for the equipment, the swing set, the fence, the shades, whatever they have there, all of those can now become reserve components. It's just the initial cost of putting it there in the first place that should not be treated as a reserve item. All right, we'll switch gears. Let's talk about reserve studies and how these are used by communities annually when they prepare their budgets. So first things first, we'll just establish the terminology. So the definition of the term reserve study, this is not something we came up with as a company. This actually comes from what are called National Reserve Study Standards. And these have been in place now for over 20 years, going back to 1998. So basically the standards determine that a reserve study is a tool, but it's a document, but it's a tool that does a couple of important things. First, it identifies the current status of the reserve fund. And then secondly, provides a funding plan that will give guidance about how to deal with future expenditures, okay? So again, let's take a step and notice what I did not say, okay? A reserve study is not the same as an insurance appraisal. It's not a turnover study. It's not a substitute for a full-on engineering analysis, okay? It's a very particular document. It's really a financial document at its core, which contains some specific content about the physical and financial elements of the community. Okay, there are 3 types of reserve studies. So if your community has never had one done before, then you would need to start with what's called a full or level 1 reserve study. So in that scope of work, the provider will be creating everything totally from scratch. Okay, a brand new site inspection, taking measurements, taking photos, gathering up all of the data that will eventually become the component list for that property, kind of the backbone of the reserve study. But once you've had that done, you've had your full study done, there are then 2 types of updates that you could do after the fact. So the first type is called an update with a site visit. In that case, that means there's a new site inspection taking place, but it's going to be based off of the existing component list, right? Just at this point, looking for any significant changes in life expectancies or cost estimates based on current conditions of the property, based on current economic conditions, recapping any work that has been done since the prior study, for example. Now, there are some states that require those types of updates at specific intervals. Florida is not one of them at this point in time, but again, we do expect that might change in the future. Either way, the best practice, long-standing best practice in the industry is that you should have an update with a new site inspection done at least every 3 years or so. Okay, now the last type of study is called an update with no site visit, which really is what it sounds like. It's still a whole new reserve study, but without a site inspection. So in this case, the provider is basically corresponding with the board, talking with the property manager to find out, what projects have you done? Have you gotten any new bids since we were there last time? And then producing a whole new study, a whole new financial analysis to go with it. Again, the only difference is just not coming back to the property itself. All right, there are two parts to this process, two parts to a reserve study, which are called the physical analysis and the financial analysis. All right, so in the physical analysis, this is the part where somebody's coming out to do that on-site visual inspection of all of the common areas of the property. So everything from the roof, mechanical equipment, amenities, the lobby, hallways, pools and tennis courts, anything and everything that the association is responsible for should be considered and evaluated as part of this process. It's pretty intensive. This takes, a lot of time measuring, photographing, but also documenting model numbers, serial numbers, taking notes about conditions, talking with maintenance personnel, basically coming up with whatever raw data we need to eventually determine the life expectancy and replacement cost for each of these components. So again, this is a collaborative process. We always try to meet with a representative from the property. That can be, finance committee members, board members, manager, all of the above. The idea is to just meet with these folks, get the benefit of their insight and experience from having lived there, having worked there, and finding out what's important to them. What are some key, concern areas, for example. Okay, the second part of this process is what we call the financial analysis. And this is everything that takes place after the inspection. So we bring all that back to the office, start inputting data into the computer and analyzing it, researching particular costs, getting details on project history, comparing that information, right? Looking at what other buildings that are similar might have spent on similar projects. So we can get an informed opinion about what's going to happen at this particular community, right? And once we've done all that, now we can start to package it up and bring it together with some financial recommendations and conclusions. Okay, there are three outcomes to a reserve study, which I'll talk through one at a time, kind of three deliverables, if you will. First and foremost, the reserve study will always contain a component list. And the word component in this context, you can think of this as an instance where the association is going to spend some money on something, right? So a reserve component could be a roof replacement. It can be resurfacing the swimming pool. It can be remodeling a lobby, right? But for any given component, there are three pieces of information that we need to determine. First, we need to determine the useful life of that component. And what we mean there is its overall lifespan. In other words, how long is it going to be in place from start to finish, either from when it was originally installed or when it was most recently replaced, until that will need to be done again. So the second estimate, second value, is the remaining useful life. Now that number is always determined relative to a certain point in time. Okay, so for example, let's say you've got a component with a useful life of 10 years, and as of this particular fiscal year, it's only 3 years old. Well, in that case, you would say, again, as of this fiscal year, its remaining useful life should be about 7 years, right? So we've got useful life and remaining life. The last thing we need to come up with is an estimate for its replacement cost, okay? And the word replacement doesn't really matter here. You don't always have to be fully replacing something to justify spending reserve money on it. Okay, you could, in some cases, say it's an upgrade, it's a remodel, it's a modernization, a resurfacing, right? Or something else. Don't get too hung up on the word choice. You don't have to be fully tearing something out and putting something new in its place to justify that as a reserve project. All right, so if you're wondering how we determine what goes on the list here, I talked earlier about the Florida statutes, what they have to say with respect to reserve budgeting. But now I'm going to give you a slightly different approach. Okay, so most professional reserve study providers are going to be using this particular 4-part test, which again comes from our National Reserve Study Standards. Now, this is more of an open-ended definition of what a reserve component should be. And the beauty of this 4-part test is that it can be applied to any different type of community. So instead of going into a project with some kind of predetermined checklist, we're instead going to go in with our eyes open, looking for anything at that community, anything on that property that might meet these criteria. So I'm going to talk through these for one at a time. The first part of the test is that the component in question has to be that association's responsibility, right? Pretty straightforward. An example of something that would typically fail this part of the test would often be the windows and doors in a condo building, right? So at least probably 99% of the time, individual unit owners are responsible for replacement of their own windows and doors. So in those cases, there's really no need for anybody to consider them in the association's funding plan. Now, if you've got an HOA where the roads are public, right, they're maintained by the city or by the county, then obviously there's no need to include funding for road repaving. All right, the second part of the test is that the component has to have a limited useful life. So in our world, I say this all the time with our clients, we don't use the word forever, but if something should last indefinitely, right, and there's no timeline where you would expect to replace it, then you probably don't need to consider that as part of your reserve plan. So as an example there, you can think of something like the foundation or the structure of the building, or maybe the electrical conduit inside the walls, right? These are things that should last the life of the property, however long that is. And so therefore, you're not actively funding for their replacement. If those things need to be replaced, it's more likely some developer is going to come in and knock down the property and build something entirely new, right? Then it would be that you'd ever have to replace them. Okay, the third part of the test here may be the most complicated, and this is that the component has to have a predictable remaining useful life in order for it to be consistent with these National Reserve Study standards. And the key word there is predictable. So to be even more specific, what I mean is predictability in terms of scope and frequency, okay? If you can't reliably predict how much money you'll spend on something or how often, then it's probably not a good idea to handle that through reserves. Okay, and I'll give you a quick example. We get a lot of communities that will ask us whether they can include their insurance deductible as part of their reserve plan, right? They're always afraid because that's a potentially very large expense. And if they ever have to pay that, you know, it's going to be a huge blow to the community. So can we treat that as a reserve component? Well, if you're thinking of it from our perspective, we're going to ask them, well, what should the useful life be, right? How often are you going to have to pay that deductible? What's the frequency there? Which of course, nobody knows. That's the whole reason we have insurance in the first place, of course, right? These expenses come as a surprise. It's a natural disaster, a hurricane, a fire, a flood. And for us or anybody else to make some arbitrary prediction about how often that might occur is kind of getting away from the whole point of having an accurate plan, right? Now, the question always comes up here, so I'm going to address it now. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have some kind of plan in place, right? In Florida, there's always going to be more hurricanes, more major storms. The only problem is that we just don't know how often or how severe. And so there's no way for us to accurately put that in a reserve study, okay? But what we do tell our clients is that it's probably a good idea to have some kind of third account or some other option on the table, right? We talked earlier about the operating account being for routine expenses. Now you can have your reserve account for all the things that do meet these criteria. But in addition to that, maybe it's a good idea to establish some kind of emergency fund or an emergency line of credit or some combination of the two that you would have available in the event you ever have to pay that insurance deductible or cover some uninsured losses, right? Cleanup of landscaping or damage done to the property that doesn't meet your threshold for a deductible, for example. Again, from our perspective, the only problem with listing it and treating it as a reserve item is that has downstream effects. We're going to be basing some funding calculations off of a specific timeline of expenses. And if the expenses are wild cards that don't fall in line with a plan, that throws off all the calculations, right? So, if I just made a wild guess and I assumed a useful life of 10 years for paying an insurance deductible, we're making a wild guess that that's gonna happen every year, every 10 years reliably and consistently. But what happens if we get 3 storms in 5 years? If the expectation is that the reserve account is going to cover that cost each time, what really happens is that now you're pulling money away from other reserve components that did have a predictable lifespan, more than likely going to result in needing special assessments to make up those shortfalls. All right. So the last part of this 4-part test, last criteria here, does this component represent a significant cost to this association? And, I showed earlier the statutory number of $10,000. Just to make that point again, we think that's kind of arbitrary, right? In most cases, from most associations, they should consider setting that threshold a lot lower. The advantage of doing it this way is that, yes, they will have now more components listed in the reserve schedule, but that takes the pressure off of the operating budget, which is otherwise the only place they can absorb those costs whenever they come along, right? So just think of it this way. Let's say there's some small community out there and they have 6 components that cost $5,000 each. Technically speaking, they would be, in line with the statutes if they left those out of their reserve plan, because individually those costs are less than $10,000. But let's say that all 6 projects need to be done around the same time. In total, that's a combined $30,000 that they're assuming they can squeeze into the operating budget, right? Now, if their cash flow is a little tight, if they got caught by surprise there, that can be a tough situation, maybe even a small special assessment that's required. But if they had them listed in the reserves all along, well, now they have the ability to use reserve money for those things. Hopefully that's less disruptive to the community. So the takeaway here, whether you're in a small community or a large one, there is no one number that's appropriate for any and all associations. Okay, I know there's a lot of material on that one, and I'll be happy to go back through the 4-part test during the Q&A if anybody wants a recap there, but let's move forward for now. On this slide, I've drawn this little red bracket at the top around these 3 components, which again are the only ones that are mentioned specifically by Statute 718. But if you look down the rest of the list, hopefully these will trigger some thinking, right? These are some of the other components that we routinely include in a reserve study, and this is by no means a comprehensive list, but again, we know the statute says that, anything over $10,000 number, but the problem we see is that a lot of communities are just not aware of how much things cost. And so that it's easy to get lost in the shuffle, right? So just to give you a very broad idea, if we're dealing with a small, simple, townhome style condo, there might be 15 or 20 individual components on the list. But if you're in any sort of, high-rise building or a, 55 and over HOA, tons of amenities, it's very easy to get up to 50, 75, even 100 components or more. All right, that was a pretty long discussion of our first outcome there, the component list. The next thing we're going to talk about is number 2, this what we call evaluation of current reserve fund strength, which we described in terms of this concept called percent funded. One of the best ways that I've found to explain percent funded as a concept is to use the analogy of a credit score. Okay, so we've all had our credit reports pulled. Hopefully you have a good idea what your score is. And you understand that to an outside party, like a bank or a credit card company, that score is an indicator of what kind of risk you are. Okay, so in the same way, if you think of the reserve study itself like a credit report, and you have to distill that down to one key result, I would say that should be percent funded. Okay, it doesn't tell the full story, as we'll see, but it's an important metric. Okay, we measure it on a 0 to 100% scale, and we consider anything between 0 and 30% funded to be a weak position. So what that means, associations in that range will have a high likelihood of special assessments and other types of cash flow problems, right? Once they get above 30% funded, now we consider that to be a fair range. Okay, the risk is more moderate. It's not an emergency anymore, but maybe there's still some room for improvement there. Where they really want to be is above 70% funded. That's where we've seen that there's the statistical lowest risk of these types of problems happening. Okay, we've talked about the concept. Now let's get into the calculation. How do you do the math here? How do you calculate percent funded? It's a fairly simple idea, fairly simple concept. All you're doing is looking at how much money an association has at some point in time, and then comparing that amount against how much the same association should have at the same point in time. Okay, we just express that comparison, that division as a percentage. All right, so the first part of the calculation is the simple part, right? We're doing a reserve study for a client. Let's say we're doing it now here in 2022. We're looking ahead to next year, 2023's budget. And what we're going to do is look at the current financial statements, right? How much cash do they have in reserves now? How much are they going to add the rest of this year? What are they going to spend this year? And where does that leave them going into 2023? That's it. So that's the first part. How much money do you have at this projected point in time? The second step is to compare that amount, to put it in context by measuring it against how much money they should have. Okay, now this notion, this concept of how much they should have, this is something that we call the fully funded balance. All right. Now, before I get into this, because this question comes up a lot, the fully funded balance is not the same as the complete replacement cost. Okay, you don't have to have all the money in the bank for something until it's at the very end of its useful life. All right, and we'll do some examples here, but for now, let me just make a few points. This fully funded balance, this is a theoretical number. And the way that we put this in perspective is to frame it as a question, okay? So if I told you that there's some association out there that has $50,000 in reserves, but I didn't tell you anything else about the place, okay? You don't know where it is, how many units, what their amenities are like, how old it is, anything else. Have I really told you anything at all, right? And I will hear this sort of thing all the time from board members. Somebody will start talking to me and say, look, we're in great shape. We have, $900,000 in our reserves. That's great, but I have no idea if that's enough, right? We have to have something to compare it against in order to know if that's adequate, right? And that's where the fully funded balance comes in. So let's just think it through, right? If we're dealing with a tiny 2-story building with really no amenities, just a parking lot, 50 grand may be plenty of money for that community. But if you're looking at a luxury high-rise, right, with all kinds of amenities, major mechanical systems, $50,000 is a drop in the bucket, right? That can be wiped out in one installment of one paint job, for example. Okay, so let's take this concept one step further. How do we calculate this fully funded balance, right? And that's a fairly simple idea. Again, all we're going to do is look at how old a component is, right? Compare that to its overall lifespan, which will give us a fraction, what you see there on the left side of the screen, age divided by useful life. We then multiply that fraction by the current estimated cost of the component, which tells us how much money that community should have today for that component's eventual replacement. Now, when you do a reserve study, it doesn't matter if you're looking at 4 components or 400, it's the same approach either way. You're going to calculate the fully funded balance for each component line by line, then add all those numbers together. That will tell you the fully funded balance for the entire association. So once you've done that, right, you go through that exercise, now you have something you can use to examine the actual cash that is on hand and put that in perspective. All right, so to bring this home, we're going to do an example. Let's all pretend that we are on the board or we're managing this property that we'll make up a name, call it Seaview Condominiums, and we're working on the budget. We want to calculate percent funded for the community as of the start of their next fiscal year. All right. I meant to fix this typo before, so apologies. Let's just pretend that says January 1st, 2023, right? We're always looking ahead when we do a reserve study. But let's say that we've reviewed our financials. We understand what we're going to spend this year. We know what's budgeted to contribute to reserves. And we're going to have 60 grand going into the start of next year. The next thing you've got to do is to calculate the fully funded balance for each component of the property. And for the sake of this example, we're just going to pretend it's 3 things. Okay, we'll look at the roof first. Let's say that the roof is 10 years old with an overall useful life of 20 years. And let's give it a replacement cost of $80,000. Okay, so if you keep in mind that the fully funded balance for this roof is the proportion of the cost that we need to have on hand today, right? That's what we need to calculate. And we know that the roof is halfway through its life. Then in theory, we only need to have half of the replacement cost saved up at this point in time, because we have another 10 years to collect the difference. So here we do the math. We take 10 over 20, multiply that by $80,000, which tells us that the theoretical fully funded balance for the roof as of now is 40 grand. It's halfway through its life. The community should have half of the replacement cost saved up. Next up, we'll talk about gym equipment. Okay, so if we assume that the gym equipment here is 5 years old and it has an overall life expectancy of 15 years and that it costs 30 grand to replace it, then we can calculate it, right? We can say that the fully funded balance for this equipment right now would be $10,000. Again, it's a third of the way through its life. Theoretically, you'll only need to have a third of this replacement cost saved up now. Last one, we'll say that we painted the hallways of the building 2 years ago, and we want to do that every 8 years, right? Useful life of 8. If the cost is 100,000, we can divide 2 by 8, so it's 1/4 or 25% of the way through its life. And if we have this cost estimate of 100 grand, we know that the fully funded balance for painting the hallways is $25,000. Okay, 1, 2, 3. The next thing we're going to do is go back to the big picture, right? We've calculated our starting reserve balance, and now that we have done the math and calculated the individual fully funded balances for each of these components, we were able to determine percent funded for the entire association. So I'm going to take those 3 numbers that I just calculated and add them together, right? 40 grand for the roof, 10 for our gym equipment, and 25 for painting gives me a total of 75,000. Now, if I look at my 60 grand that I did have, divide that by 75, I can determine that my association is 80% funded. Okay, and that would be a strong position, but there's some room for improvement there. Okay, so before we move on from this section, I'm going to wrap up probably in the next 5 to 10 minutes, go into the Q&A. Let's talk about how you can start to draw financial conclusions about associations using percent funded. So what you're looking at on this chart here, this is the result of a very large internal analysis that our company did, I don't know, 5 or 10 years ago. We looked at a data set which was comprised of thousands of associations. And we tried to measure for 2 things, 2 variables. First of all, what was their percent funded level? You know, what was the total percent funded for the association in that reserve study? And then secondly, did we have to include any recommendations for special assessments in the funding plan? And the results were pretty obvious, right? The closer an association is to 0% funded, right? The weaker they are, the less cash they have on hand, the higher the frequency that they will need immediate special assessments as part of their funding going forward. Now, if anything, this actually undersells the risk, okay? Because what we measured for here was just whether or not there were immediate special assessments. Okay, that's not to say that if a community is 40% funded but not contributing enough money, if they don't start, increasing the budget and raising their reserve contributions, they will slip into this high risk area pretty soon, right? Because they're not keeping pace with deterioration. Okay, a few years later, we did another study, this time looking at the correlation between percent funded and actual property values for homes within communities. So this time we looked at a data set from one big metropolitan area, basically greater Los Angeles, California, and we selected a group of properties that were all as similar as they could be in terms of their size, their age, the amenities, and so on and so forth. The next step was to measure the appraised market value of the homes in those communities to see what difference it would make if the associations themselves were in a better financial position. So to be specific, what we wanted to know was, what type of increase do you see if an association is in a better financial position as measured by percent funded? So the first thing we did was set a baseline. Okay, if we look at communities that are in a weak position between 0 to 30% funded, and we say that they are coming in at this, dollars per square foot average price point, they're comparable, sister properties, the ones that are 30 to 70% funded, on average tended to be about 8% higher in terms of dollars per square foot market value. And if you go to the associations that are 70% and above, it was closer to a 13% gain in property value. So you can kind of intuitively see how that would be the case, right? The associations that have more money in the bank tend to have better curb appeal, right? They have newer amenities, they have up-to-date technology. Maybe they have more, stable management, less frequent turnover of residents, fewer renters, right? But all of these things add up to be important to property value. So if you go back to one of our fundamental questions here, why are reserves even important? Well, one argument is that higher percent funded, more money in the bank can actually translate into higher property values for your community. All right. We're going to switch back now. This is our third and final outcome that you would get from a reserve study, which is your funding plan. So if you think of the first 2 being the component list, which is essentially defining what it is you're reserving for, And then we talked about percent funded, which tells us where a community stands as of a particular point in time. It's measuring their reserve fund strength. Now that you know those two things, the only remaining question is, well, where do you go from here? Okay, and this is where the funding plan comes in. So one of the first things we do when we're designing these plans is to look at the current budget and just try to see what happens if the client stays with what they're doing now, if the status quo just continues. So what happens over time given their future expenditures? We can model that out with a spreadsheet pretty easily. And if it's clear that their existing budget for reserves is not going to be sufficient, well, then we have to recommend some changes. All right. Two of the other points to make here are that the funding of reserves needs to be consistent with the timing of your overall assessments. Okay, so for example, if your community has monthly dues that it collects from the owners, there needs to be a monthly reserve contribution. I believe by law, it actually has to be made within 30 days. In other words, what you cannot do is just operate all throughout the year, just hoping that at the end of the year, you have some kind of surplus in operating, which you transfer into reserves and say, hey, we funded our account this year. It's not supposed to work that way. It needs to be a proactive plan. And the last point to make here is that in those cases where the historical contribution rate has not been sufficient, right, if the association is in bad shape, then unfortunately there might need to be an initial special assessment as part of that plan, right? And if that's the case, in those times, it's appropriate to think of a special assessment as a form of a catch-up contribution, right? It's correcting for all the prior years when the budget was insufficient and not enough was being put aside into reserves. Okay, last couple of slides here, we're going to talk about our key principles that come into play when we're designing these plans, which I'll talk about one at a time. First and foremost, as you look to the future, as you model out reserve expenses over time, at the bare minimum, the amount of money that you're putting into reserves over that period of time has got to ensure that you have some remaining cash on hand, right? This is actually the bare minimum requirement. It's something that we call baseline funding. But as you look out over the next 10, 20, 30 years, you're looking at how much money you're expected to pay. If you end with no money in the bank or a negative number in the bank after some project, then you have to go back to the beginning and start with a higher contribution rate. Otherwise, you're basically guaranteed to need a special assessment or a loan, which is one of the things we're trying to avoid in the first place. The contributions to reserves also should be stable. So what that means is that you shouldn't have huge spikes and decreases in the contribution rate over time based on arbitrary fluctuations. It's not fair to assume that there's some future group of owners who will be perfectly willing and able to just double their reserve contribution rate from one year to the next, making it super easy on the people who live there today, right? We're not allowed to plug in any balloon contributions. So an example of that is, let's say you've got $1 million roof replacement project, but it's not happening for 10 years from now. You can't just budget this year with the expectation that in year 9, you're going to raise $950,000 because, boy, wouldn't that be nice? We don't have to really put away any money between now and then. You're not allowed to do that. Okay, you also don't take years off. So what we mean here is that let's say you've just spent a huge amount of money modernizing your elevators, and now you don't have to do that again for another 20, 25 years. That does not mean that you stop funding reserves for elevator modernization. It will happen again, and you should begin funding for the next time around as early as possible so that you spread the cost of the component over the longest period of time that you can, right? The idea here is that the association members should be paying for the deterioration of components over the entire useful life of those components, not all at once, right, when something fails. When you do it in the way I described, everybody pays their fair share, right? It's not just some unlucky group of people who happen to live in a property when the life expectancies for all these components wear out and they get stuck with the whole bill, right? That's like playing musical chairs, right? Now, the very last, but maybe the most important principle to follow when we're designing a funding plan is that it's got to be fiscally responsible. So what do we mean by that? Okay, that means being realistic with respect to interest and inflation. It's not realistic to assume that you're going to earn 10% interest return on your invested funds. Unfortunately, we know that reserve money just can't be invested in anything very exciting. So that means you should be assuming a fairly low return on those funds. You know, anything from maybe 0 to 1% is unfortunately pretty typical. With respect to inflation, and I know this is going to come up in the Q&A, so I'm trying to get out in front of this one a little bit. You also need to be realistic there, okay? The last 18 months, 2 years have been crazy, but what we have found in normal times is that when you look back over historical data trends, if you look at a long enough period of time, the average annual inflation rate tends to be about 3%. So just as a baseline, you want to consider something in the low single digits as a normal number. If you're assuming that the cost of a project 15 years from now is going to be the same as what it costs today, then you're probably going to be way off and your plan's just not going to work, okay? The second point on this slide speaks to being honest about the situation that you're in, okay? So if you're in an association that has not historically done a good job at this, they're not funding their reserves, it's time to address that. It's not going to get any better if you let the problem go. Right? It's actually financially irresponsible to just continue operating the way you always have, just to maintain some status quo. For you board members out there, just a reminder, it is not your job to make the owners happy, right? It is not your job to keep the dues low compared to the building next door. Okay. Speaking of the owners, the reserve funding plan cannot be biased in favor of the people who live there now at the expense of the people who will live there later on. Again, it's not fair to assume that they'll just pick up the tab for you. And lastly, this all takes place despite what may have happened up to now. We see it all the time. The prior years weren't funding the reserves, and the association has had the can kicked to them, right? That's not an excuse to kick the can down the road for the next group, right? In a perfect world, all associations would have been carefully managed. They would have been guided over the years. They would have been responsible, and they would be in a strong financial position now. But it's not a perfect world, right? We know that's not the case. But even so, that does not remove the obligation from the board of directors to act responsibly and to fulfill their fiduciary duty. All right. Having said all of that, at the end of the day, of course, we recognize this is going to be a challenge for most communities. Okay. If there's an association out there that has been operating for many years without funding properly, there's a really good chance they're going to be in a deep financial hole that's going to be hard to climb out of. But it's important to address that. Don't mask that, okay? The owners in the community deserve to make an informed decision. So, whether or not you have a reserve study done, that's a choice you can make. But it is a helpful way to just understand what the obligations are and to know that if the reserves aren't funded properly, what the consequences might be. If that's going to require special assessments or loans when those things need to be done. So to tie it all back together, if you remember the guy that I showed you back there in the beginning, right? Eyes closed, fingers crossed, hoping for the best. If I've done anything good here today, hopefully you agree that that sort of attitude is not a substitute for a responsible financial plan. So thanks everybody for joining us today. I hope you've all got some good information. I'm going to turn my camera back on here, take a sip of water, and then dig into the list. So I haven't seen any of these questions before, so I'm going to try to do my best with these, kind of going on the fly. Before I do that, Ashley, did you have any announcements or anything you want to make?
No announcements. We will, I will be sending everything out after, which is what I previously mentioned, the presentation. So you'll get all the slides, the link to the video recording. We should have your CAM number. So I'm going to send that over to Will so you guys can get your credits. I did just launch a poll. So if you can take that for us, if you have to jump off and you're not going to stay for this Q&A portion. Otherwise, thank you for coming. Will, thanks for doing it. Really appreciate it. You always do a great job. And yeah, everybody have a great day. I'm going to turn my stuff off and take that poll when you can, and we'll go ahead with the questions.
Okay, sure. So just in terms of kind of preamble before I look over the list, there's at this point 55 open questions. There's no way I'm going to get through all those. So what I might try to do is scan over these, and if people are asking kind of some of the same questions, I might try to address a group of questions all in one answer. If there's any questions that are very specific to your unique situation, right, that I wouldn't have the answer to unless we actually knew more about the place, if we did a reserve study for you, then you'll have to forgive me for maybe skipping over that one. My email is up there on the screen. If you have other questions that come up later on, feel free to send me an email. I usually get quite a lot of emails after these webinars. So if it takes me a couple of days to get back to you, I appreciate your patience. But I'm going to kind of just try to start at the top and work my way down. And if I'm not sure what the question's asking, forgive me, I'll do my best with it. But let's see. Here's a good one. We've exhausted our plumbing reserves because our cast iron pipes have been breaking. They're 50 years old. This was not included in the 40-year inspection, so we were caught off guard. We filed an assessment to handle the replacement of the pipe throughout the building, but my question is, should the assessment include the refunding of the plumbing reserves that were used for emergency use of patching repairs for the pipes, or do we leave our reserves empty and just create an assessment for the cost of this one plumbing issue and slowly accumulate reserves from zero on a monthly basis going forward? Great question. So yeah, a couple of things there. The 40-year inspections that are now required in Dade and Broward that we may see become more popular throughout the state, those are not going to look at plumbing. Those are only for structural evaluation and electrical and maybe a little bit of life safety. They don't look at piping at all. For your properties out there that are in older buildings, definitely something you want to look into. You need, the best way to do it really is to have those diagnosed by a plumbing company or some kind of mechanical engineer maybe, where they take a camera and actually look down through the stack of each pipe and determine the conditions. Otherwise, it's very hard to know what's happening there. As far as what you do with the financial situation, you could kind of go either way. I mean, if you were really caught off guard, then yeah, special assessment, unfortunately, sometimes is the right way to go. But now that you're going to have all new piping, I would say that you should just be able to start to accumulate reserves going forward on a monthly basis. So if you set that useful life for your new piping as 50 years, and now you know what it costs to do that, you have a good cost estimate, you can start accumulating for the next time over, starting from now going forward. So good question. I don't know if I quite answered that one, but I hope so. Please discuss how you can propose the association partially fund the reserves. Okay, so this is an interesting question because it depends on which methodology the association is using. We have a whole nother class that we'll probably do later this summer with Campbell called reserve funding methodologies, which talks about the difference between straight line reserves and the pooled method of reserves. So partial funding actually has a different calculation, different context in either one. But from a kind of logistical standpoint, what the board is obligated to do, the board has to show the association membership each year what it would take to fully fund the reserves. The board is actually not obligated to propose partial funding or waiving of reserves. But what happens a lot is that boards will anticipate a lot of pushback and a lot of people saying we can't afford this, and so they will offer two options. They'll say, here's our budget with full funding of reserves. This is what we have to show you. That's plan A, but here's plan B, right? And if we can get a majority of our owners, or sometimes just a majority of a quorum, to vote for plan B, then we are partially funding our reserves this year. Otherwise, if that vote doesn't happen or if it doesn't pass, then by default, the full funding of reserves does go into effect. So, you can get a little bit more complicated going forward, depending if it's an HOA or a condo, and if the HOA has statutory or non-statutory reserves. But that's about how it goes, right? So again, the board is always obligated to present full funding. It's only upon the vote of the owners that partial funding can take effect. All right, with the high increase in costs seen recently, what percentage increase in reserves would you suggest for next year's budget? That's a good one. I don't know what the latest figures are, 7%, 8% inflation, something like that year over year. So if you just had to pick one number, I would say something like that. But if you can drill down on particular items, there are certain things that may have outpaced those numbers even higher. So anything tied to the price of oil, right? If you live in a big community that has a lot of asphalt pavement, you probably want to assume that the cost of, resurfacing pavement has gone up quite a bit more than that, just because of the oil situation being what it is. Things like elevators, things like air conditioners, anything that has components that are manufactured overseas that might have been disrupted by a supply chain, those I might say, 10 to 15%. It's really an ongoing situation that we're trying our best to stay on top of. But if I just had to give everybody advice, knowing nothing else about your community compared to what you did last year to this year, at least 5%, more like 7 or even 10% probably would be good. And that's if you were doing a good job before, right? If you were at a high level of percent funded already. If not, if you were trying to play catch up for even prior years, then maybe even higher than that. Okay, can a Florida condo reserve for deductible under the association's required property insurance? Legally speaking, they can, but what I tried to address in the class is that it's not such a good idea because it's unpredictable. So again, I would recommend you consider an emergency fund or an emergency line of credit as your first defense against having to pay that deductible. Leave your reserve money for the things that are predictable and recurring in nature. Okay, yes, just for folks that are asking the slides, the whole recording of the session is going to be made available. That'll be emailed to everybody afterwards. I'll try to address this one briefly. Can board members revise a budget for operating and reserve items without another formal budget meeting and notice? I don't think so, but I'm not an attorney. It's a great question for an attorney. I think generally speaking, you probably would have to have another budget meeting, but I don't know. There might be something in your governing documents that have something to say there, but that's a good question for your HOA attorney. Okay. Let's see, using my practical definition, a structural engineering study could not be funded from reserve funds. Is that correct? Well, let's just go back to the 4-part test. Okay, if it's the association's responsibility to pay the bill, which it is, does it have a limited useful life? Yeah, it's not a once in a lifetime thing. You probably should have your building observed by a structural engineer, especially if it's an older property on the coast or you have any sort of concerns there. Does it have a predictable remaining life? It could, right? So if you're setting up a plan where every 5 years or every 7 years, you're going to want to bring in an engineer to do an inspection that now has a predictable timeline to it. And if the cost is significant, as you know, these costs for engineering fees definitely can be, then I would say it meets our 4-part test. More often than not, you're typically not spending money on on professionals as a reserve component. It's usually for repair and replacement of things that have a physical nature to them. But if you wanted to budget for every 5 years having your elevators inspected by a consultant, that is feasible. You can do that. There's no reason why that's illegal. Kind of a similar question, can reserve funds be used to fund a reserve study? Yes, if it's on a predictable timeline and you feel that the cost is significant to your budget, then I would say yes. But in reality, the cost of a reserve study for the most part is something that should be fairly easy for an association to put in their operating budget. In case the question comes up later, I'll just address it now. The typical cost for a reserve study can vary, obviously, based on the size of the property, the location, the time of year, the number of components, all that kind of stuff. On average, the really rough ballpark cost for a condo in South Florida might be $3,000 to $5,000 for a full reserve study, and a fraction of that cost for updates. So, for most communities, this is not a 5-figure project. It's more often not something that they would deal with in the operating budget, but you can if you meets that 4-part test. Okay, what is the best approach to take when a board realizes that they have not been reserving for the repair or replacement of a substantial community element? What should be considered when adding this reserve line item? First of all, that's okay. I mean, boards are not always, aware of what they should be doing, but as soon as you identify something that meets the criteria for a reserve component, from then on, yeah, absolutely, you should add that into your reserve schedule. Talk to vendors, have a reserve study done, find out, what is its useful life? What is its remaining useful life? Do you have any money set aside? If you have pooled reserves, can you add this to your new pooled schedule to try to capture that going forward? So yeah, it happens all the time. We have a lot of clients that just do the roofing, painting, and pavement, and then maybe 1 or 2 other things. We come in and have 25, 30 line items that they now should be reserving. Well, it's a new year, it's a new reserve schedule. Let's put all that on the list from now on. What level, I guess this is what level of service is appropriate if you change inspectors. So if you move from one reserve study company to another. I guess that kind of depends on your confidence in the prior study. So it is possible to do a reserve study off of another company's prior study. We do that semi often. In that case, all we're using are the quantities that were in the prior study. So whatever they had for square footage of roofing, linear feet of balcony railings, that kind of thing. If we don't need to remeasure the property, then it's a faster site inspection. It's more of an update. So it's a slightly lower price point, but it basically assumes that everything that was in the prior study is accurate. So if you have any concern about that or any hesitation, I would say maybe best to start with a new level 1, a new full study. Okay, is a good question here. Is the replacement cost dependent on the current year or future years? So when you look at the cost on the reserve schedule, the current replacement cost is what we're going to show. What does it cost if you had to do that work now? But if something has some years left of remaining life, when we're modeling that into the future, then you should consider inflation to figure out what it is likely to be at the actual time you do the work, because that's a more realistic number to plan with. Let's see, what prevents a condo board from using reserve funds for other high ticket projects? So the context here would matter. I guess it's, are you talking about straight line reserves where you have a roof reserve, for example, and an elevator reserve fund, and you want to use money from roofing to pay for an elevator project? That requires the owners actually to approve the use of those funds for something other than which they were originally intended. If it's pooled, excuse me, let me take a sip of water here. I'm trying to get these done as fast as I can for you guys. If it's a situation where you have pooled reserves and there's some other big ticket cost, I guess it depends on, is it a reserve project or not? Because if it's pooled reserves, then there's no issue. You can use all of your pooled funds towards anything on your reserve schedule. If it's something else, if it's a legal settlement, right? If somebody sues the association and you have to pay out a judgment of $100,000, then you're actually not able to do that unless the owners vote to allow it. So there are mechanisms in place that prevent boards from using funds for something other than they're intended for. If they're being reckless, then then they can actually be found in violation of what's called the business judgment rule and in breach of fiduciary duty, and then held personally liable for any shortfalls the association may come to. Again, I'm bleeding over into legal territory, which isn't my field, but that is an important point for everyone to understand. If you have a board out there that is acting recklessly, their D&O coverage, the directors and officers liability coverage, will not protect them from personal liability if they are knowingly in breach of fiduciary duty and acting kind of intentionally in that way. So to me, that's something that all board members need to understand, and hopefully that's something that prevents them from behaving badly. Beyond roofing, painting, and pavement, what determines that a project is a reserve project? It's not I don't believe it should be a board vote. It's certainly not a membership vote. I think it's just something that you would add to your reserve schedule as soon as you've identified that it should be there. Okay, can landscaping, specifically tree removal and replacement, be a reserve category? Yes, it can. I think the sticking part there is it predictable, right? So if you've got a pattern of expenses where that every 3 years you're spending a reliably predictable number on this project, and you just want to model that going forward, and it meets the 4-part test, then I would say, yeah, that could be a reserve category. So yeah, landscaping improvements, even if you just want to replant your planter beds at the entrance to the community, just as kind of a refreshing project every 10 years, you can list that as a reserve component too. Okay, can you transfer money from one reserve item to another reserve item? Yeah, well, again, it depends on if it's straight line or pooled. If it's straight line reserves, which again, we cover that in depth in our other class, which I would encourage everybody to tune into. Then yes, you can move money from one to the other as long as the owners vote to approve that. If it's pooled, then there is no vote necessary. You have one big pool of funds that is collectively available for anything on the list. Let's see, do you recommend a minimum amount of reserves that should be maintained for a multi-building condo with around 170 units appraised at $78 million? I don't even need the last part of the question there. Yes, there's always a minimum amount of reserves that any condo with however many units and any appraised value should have. I'll give you maybe a slightly different answer to the question. What we have found is that associations that are doing a good job at this, right, that are in a high level of percent funded, on average, they tend to be contributing between 15 and 40% of the annual budget to reserves. So in other words, this is not an afterthought. It's not, it's not what's left over at the end. Reserve funding should be probably one of the biggest line items in the annual budget, if not the biggest, right? Maybe up there with insurance for a lot of properties, but if you're just looking for a quick, soundbite of wisdom, 15 to 40% of the annual budget, that tends to be a good number for reserves. Let's see. Is there a way other than significant assessments that an HOA can legally increase their reserves? Yeah, I could think of, if there's a, the association gets a windfall settlement from a developer, for example, money can be contributed to reserves. Special assessments, routine, ongoing contributions. Yes, those can all be used to increase the reserve balance. Okay, assume a distressed condominium has waived reserves year after year and is in need of a structural repair in the next 2 years. Is there a substantial ramp up in reserves over the next 2 years to pay for the structural repairs, or are those repairs paid through funds collected through a special assessment? Could go either way. So I think we would need to know the complete context of the situation there, look at what other costs may be coming up. If their reserves are pooled and there's ample money in reserves to do that, then maybe you don't need a special assessment. But if the question is based on the fact that they've been waiving them for years, I would say probably a special assessment would be the right thing to do. Right? For everybody out there, remember that a special assessment is just the inevitable catch-up contribution required for not having budgeted enough in prior years. So to me, maybe a combination of the two: special assessment just to get up off the ground, kind of shot in the arm, and then a commitment to a healthy number going forward. Let's see, if a condo association is at 79% funded, as you recommend, does the association have to get owner approval since the reserves are not fully funded? If not, why not? That's a good question. So let me get real specific on terminology here. Fully funded means that your cash on hand at this point in time is exactly equal to the value of deterioration, right? So as we look through those examples, you look at roofing, we looked at gym equipment and painting, and we looked at ideally where all those things should have been. And if they were exactly where they should have been, they would be 100% funded. Fully funding is the process by which you get to that position. Okay, so the owners don't have to approve anything if an association is not fully funded right now. Right? But they do have to weigh in if they are not going to commit to fully funding going forward. Not sure if that's clear or not, but it's very rare for an association to be currently 100% funded. So if we do a study and the client's 33% funded, they don't have to have a vote of their owners to go to 100% in the next year. They just need to be on a path to get there. Long term, if that makes sense. All right, it's about 1:15. I'm going to try to go on for maybe another 5 to 10 minutes, and then I do have to break for another call, so I'll give it my best here. If you are just starting reserves, how long should you take to get to 70% or better? That's a good question. There is some subjectivity to that. Some associations might say, we want to get there within 5 years, right? We want to ramp up this contribution rate, get ourselves up to this strong level. We're going to commit to a higher level of funding, and then maybe we can level off and slowly go from 70 to 100. Others might say, we're going to do it over 20 years or 30 years. That's really a choice each association has to make. I just think that the important thing is that you're always seeking a high target as your objective. If you want to get there sooner, that's great. If you want to get there eventually, that's okay. As long as along the way you have ample money to pay for your projects and you're not constantly trying to scrape the barrel and run with these very, very tight margins. So it's, there is a bit of subjectivity to how long it would take to get there. You can kind of think of it like retirement funding, right? Some people would, prefer to have all the money in the bank at age 40 or 45. Others might say 50, 55, 60, 70. It really just depends, on kind of your preference and what your goals are at that point. Okay, let's see. I've only got a few minutes left, so I'm going to try to pick out any that are maybe might address a lot of people's questions. Let's see. Yeah, a lot of questions on inflation. Again, this is something that is a very difficult moving target to hit. Inflation is always a part of the economy. Usually it's only 2-3%, sometimes 1%, sometimes 5%. But I guess the important thing is not to look at inflation as this one broad number that applies evenly to all things, right? Some projects are very costly from a material standpoint, right? If you're changing out a boiler or an air conditioner, the bulk of the cost is in the equipment, right? You're going to pay somebody to deliver it and install it, but that's not the majority of the cost. So contrast that with something like painting, where the majority of the cost of painting is in labor. So if you look at things that are very labor driven, you would want to use a model that factors in the cost of wages. If you're looking at something that's very material driven, particularly if it's coming from overseas, as unfortunately most things do, you want to look at supply chain issues. The best way to combat this is maybe pick your top 4 or 5 or 6 most expensive things in your reserve study and call the vendors and just ask them. This is what we do, right? If I call up an elevator company, I'm saying, hey, look, last year you told me it was 100,000 for this. Given the current market, is it 110? Is it 120? Where are we at? So pick your biggest pain points as a community, your biggest things that if you don't get those right will have a big impact, and then try to address in more detail what the consequences might be. All right, I think I'm going to try one more question here. Do I have an opinion on pooled versus line item reserves? I do, and I have a very strong opinion that pooling is by far the way to go. I've mentioned it a few times, but that is, the heart of the other class we teach is a breakdown of, first of all, what the two methods are, how they're used, how you calculate funding in each one. But I will tell you, just again, because we're a national company, we have 12 offices throughout the US. Nobody outside of Florida uses the straight line method, period. I mean, maybe there's a couple communities out there that I'm not aware of, but our company collectively does thousands of reserve studies a year. All of them are using the pooled method. It's only in Florida that you still have communities using straight line. There's a lot of disadvantages that straight line reserves bring to me. First of all, they're more expensive. If you have the same community that's looking at straight line versus pooling, I mean, 99.9% of the time, they can save a substantial amount of money by pooling the reserves, right? And everybody out there understands one of the biggest, pushbacks you get as a board is, hey, we can't afford this. Our dues are going up too high. One of the best ways you can combat that is to pool your reserves. That will reduce the amount of money that you have to collect from your owners in order to properly fund. So with that, I think I'm about to lose my voice, so I'm going to call it a day. Ashley, if you're still there, thank you very much for putting this on. Always a pleasure, and I guess you'll be handling the follow-up with everybody else. So for those the questions that I didn't get to, I do apologize. Lots of great questions asked today, and we'll see everybody next time. All right. So thanks, everyone, and have a great day.